On July 3rd, a small town in Australia was told to evacuate, not because of a fire, not because of a flood, because something fell out of the sky and nobody could explain what it was. 6 silver spheres, solid, metallic, roughly twice the size of a basketball, sitting in the sand on a quiet beach in Queensland, with bolts sticking out of both sides like something torn straight off a machine nobody recognized. Within hours, firefighters in full hazmat suits were standing over them. A 50-meter exclusion zone went up around the beach, and on social media, thousands of people were asking the same question at the same time. What is this, and where did it come from? Stay with me, because what the Australian Space Agency found out over the next 72 hours is stranger than most people realize, and it's connected to a much bigger problem quietly building above all of our heads. A problem that has nothing to do with aliens and everything to do with what humanity has been doing above the atmosphere for the last 70 years without ever really cleaning up after itself. It starts on Forest Beach, a tiny stretch of coastline in North Queensland, near a town of about 1,300 people. This isn't a tourist hotspot. It's the kind of quiet, sleepy beach where the biggest event of the week is usually a good tide for fishing. Late in the week, locals walking the shoreline started noticing something odd sitting in the sand. Not driftwood, not a buoy, not anything that belonged there. Silver spheres, heavy, metallic, each one roughly the size of 2 basketballs pushed together, with strange, bolted fittings on either side, like they'd been ripped straight out of something bigger. Witnesses described them as looking almost too clean, too deliberately built to be ordinary junk. This wasn't rusted scrap metal. This was precision-engineered hardware, sitting on an empty beach like it had been placed there on purpose. At first, nobody knew what they were looking at. Within a day, the Queensland Fire Department was on scene, treating the objects as potentially hazardous. A specialist science team moved in. They secured the area. They put up an exclusion zone and told residents to stay back, because at that point, absolutely nothing was confirmed. Not what the spheres were made of, not what might be inside them, not where they came from, and not, most importantly, whether they were dangerous. That last part matters more than people realize. Rocket hardware often carries traces of extremely toxic and flammable propellants, substances that can cause serious harm on contact, or worse, if disturbed the wrong way. So for the first crucial hours after discovery, emergency responders had to treat these objects the same way they'd treat an unexploded device. Approach carefully, assume the worst, get people away first, ask questions later. And that's when the internet did what the internet always does. Within hours, theories exploded online. Some people said military hardware. Some people said a downed satellite. And a very vocal group of people said something much stranger. That these were pieces of a crashed spacecraft. That the shape, the material, the mystery, all pointed to something not built by any government on Earth. Screenshots of the spheres spread across social media platforms, stripped of context, captioned with everything from government cover-up to first contact. For a few days, a beach town of 1,300 people became the center of a very real, very public guessing game, watched by people who had never heard of Forest Beach in their lives. This isn't the first time a piece of hardware falling out of the sky has triggered exactly this kind of panic. Throughout history, unexplained objects appearing without warning have a track record of scrambling people's sense of reality faster than almost anything else. And every single time, the pattern is nearly identical. Confusion first, fear second, wild theories third. And somewhere down the line, usually days later, a mundane, technical, very human explanation. Here's the part almost nobody expected. The answer wasn't hiding for long, and it might be even stranger than the alien theory once you understand what it actually means. On July 6th, the Australian Space Agency broke its silence. In a statement posted online, the agency said the recovered objects appeared to be pressure vessels from a space launch vehicle. In plain terms, these weren't random junk. They were a specific, identifiable type of rocket component. And according to the agency, their location and characteristics were consistent with debris from a rocket body that had recently re-entered the atmosphere from orbit. Translation: this wasn't alien, it was ours. Or at least, it was somebody's. Space debris experts had a nickname ready almost immediately. They called them Spaceballs. According to Alice Gorman, an associate professor at Flinders University who studies space junk for a living, these spherical pressure vessels are a well-known category of debris. Rockets and spacecraft often carry pressurized fuel systems, and the tanks holding that fuel are built from materials tough enough to survive extreme heat and pressure. Because of that, these tanks are some of the only rocket parts that regularly survive the fiery trip back through Earth's atmosphere completely intact, while almost everything else around them is torn apart or incinerated. Gorman explains something else that made the mystery click into place. Empty pressure vessels with no fuel left inside are often buoyant, which means these spheres likely didn't fall directly onto the beach at all. They almost certainly splashed down somewhere out in the ocean first, then drifted for days or weeks before the tide finally pushed them onto shore, quietly, with nobody watching, until a local happened to walk past at exactly the right moment. So the picture becomes clearer. Somewhere, a rocket launched. At some point after reaching orbit, part of that rocket separated and eventually fell back toward Earth. As it tore through the atmosphere at speeds many times faster than a bullet, generating heat intense enough to vaporize aluminum and steel, most of it burned away completely. But 6 spherical fuel tanks survived, splashed into the ocean far from any shipping lane or coastline, floated for an unknown stretch of time, and eventually washed up on a beach nobody was expecting them on, thousands of miles from wherever the rocket had actually launched. That's the science. But here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because as of the most recent update, the Australian Space Agency still hasn't confirmed which rocket these came from, or which country launched it. Their official statement says they are continuing to engage with international authorities to formally confirm the launch vehicle and the launching state. In other words, days after identifying what the objects are, nobody has publicly said who they belong to. Think about what that actually means. A piece of hardware, large enough to require a hazmat response and a public evacuation warning, fell from orbit, crossed an unknown distance through the atmosphere, and landed on a populated coastline. And there is currently no public confirmation of which nation is responsible for putting it there. Under international space law, countries are technically responsible for damage caused by objects they launch, even decades after the fact. The framework goes back to a treaty from the 1970s, built specifically to establish who owes what when a piece of space hardware causes harm on the ground. On paper, it sounds airtight. In practice, it depends entirely on being able to prove exactly which country's rocket you're looking at. And identifying the exact launch vehicle behind a piece of debris this generic, this stripped of markings, this far removed from any obvious paper trail, can take investigators weeks or even months. Sometimes it never happens at all. Serial numbers get burned away in re-entry. Manufacturing marks get scorched beyond recognition. What's left is often just bare, anonymous metal, the kind that could plausibly belong to any one of dozens of countries currently launching rockets into orbit. This isn't the first time this has happened. It's not even close to the first time. It's just the most recent chapter in a pattern that's been quietly accelerating for years, and almost nobody outside the space industry is paying attention to it. Let's rewind for a second, because this Queensland incident sits inside a much bigger, much stranger trend. In December of 2024, a massive metal ring crashed down onto a village in Kenya. Investigators later identified it as a separation ring, the kind of component used to detach a payload from a rocket once it reaches orbit. It came down hard enough to be treated as a serious incident on the ground, not just a curiosity. Villagers reportedly heard the impact before they ever saw what had landed. It could just as easily have come down on a house, a market, or a school. In 2023, a large metal dome washed up on a beach near Perth in Western Australia. That one took months to identify. For a while, it sat in headlines as an unsolved mystery, exactly the way the Queensland spheres did. Locals speculated. Journalists speculated. Even some scientists were cautious about jumping to conclusions too early. Eventually, India confirmed it had come from one of its polar satellite launch vehicles, closing a case that had stayed open for the better part of a year. Back in July of 2022, debris believed to be from a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft, the same type of capsule that once carried astronauts to the International Space Station, was found scattered across the snowy mountains in southern Australia. A vehicle that once carried human lives to orbit ended its story as unidentified wreckage on a hiking trail, discovered by hikers who had no idea what they'd stumbled onto until experts confirmed it weeks later. That same month, fragments from the core stage of a Chinese rocket rained down across parts of Malaysia and Indonesia after an uncontrolled re-entry, forcing airspace warnings and prompting real concern from residents on the ground who had no advance notice it was coming. Flights were rerouted. Local authorities scrambled to issue guidance in real time, working with information that was, at best, only partially accurate until the debris had already landed. And going back even further, in 2011, a massive spherical object was discovered sitting in remote grassland in Namibia. Experts at the time believed it was a fuel tank from an unmanned rocket, one that may have once held a highly volatile propellant. It sat there, mysterious and unexplained, in almost the exact same shape as the objects that just washed up in Queensland more than a decade later on the other side of the planet. For weeks, it made international headlines as one of the strangest, unexplained finds of the year, before quietly fading into the same category all of these incidents eventually land in. Solved. Filed away. Forgotten by everyone except the people who study this for a living. Different countries, different rockets, different decades. Same basic story, over and over again. Something goes up, not all of it comes back down under control. And every few months, somewhere on Earth, someone stumbles onto a piece of it, with no warning, no explanation, and often no immediate answer about where it came from. Here's the number that should genuinely concern you. According to space debris researchers, there are currently more than 130 million pieces of debris orbiting our planet. The vast majority are tiny fragments, smaller than a coin, invisible from the ground, but still moving fast enough to punch through a spacecraft. But roughly 29,000 of them are larger than 10 centimeters, big enough to seriously damage a satellite on impact, and in some cases, big enough to survive re-entry and reach the ground completely intact, exactly like what happened on Forest Beach. And the number of active satellites above us is climbing at a pace that makes this problem worse every single year. Since 2019, the number of working satellites in orbit has grown from roughly 1,000 to more than 14,500. A huge share of that growth belongs to a single satellite constellation, part of a broader boom in commercial space activity that shows no signs of slowing down. More launches means more rocket stages. More rocket stages means more uncontrolled re-entries. More uncontrolled re-entries means more mystery objects washing up on more beaches, crashing into more villages, and landing in more backyards, with no warning and often no immediate way to know who sent them. A researcher at Swinburne University of Technology put it simply, with so much debris now orbiting the planet, discoveries like fiery re-entries or strange objects washing up on shore are no longer rare surprises. They're becoming a regular part of living on a planet surrounded by an ever-growing shell of human-made junk, quietly circling above every single one of us, all day, every day, whether we think about it or not. So, how does anyone even track this stuff in the first place? Militaries and space agencies around the world run enormous tracking networks, using ground-based radar and telescopes to monitor objects in orbit large enough to be detected. The biggest of these networks can track thousands of objects simultaneously, cataloging their orbits, watching how they shift over time, and flagging when something's orbit starts decaying, meaning it's losing altitude and heading toward an eventual re-entry. For big, well-known objects, like a dead satellite or a spent rocket stage still in one piece, this system actually works reasonably well. Agencies can often predict a re-entry window days in advance, narrowing down roughly when an object will fall out of orbit, even if they can't say exactly where. But that's where the system starts to break down. Predicting a rough day is very different from predicting an exact location. As an object gets closer to re-entry, its trajectory becomes far more sensitive to tiny variations. Atmospheric drag, unexpected tumbling, small changes in orientation that are almost impossible to account for from the ground. Even with the best models available, agencies often can't pin down the landing zone until just a few hours before impact. sometimes less. And that's for the objects big enough to actually be tracked in the first place. Individual components, like the 6 spherical pressure vessels that ended up on Forest Beach, are usually part of something larger when they're in orbit. They only become separate, individually falling objects once the surrounding structure breaks apart during re-entry. At that point, there's no meaningful way to track each fragment separately. They simply appear, sometimes literally splashing into an ocean, sometimes landing directly on solid ground, with no warning system in the world flagging it in advance. Now here's the question that should actually keep you thinking after this video ends. If a piece of debris this size can fall out of orbit, survive the trip through the atmosphere, splash down in an ocean, drift for an unknown period of time, and land on a public beach, all without any advance public warning about exactly where it would come down, what happens the day one of these doesn't land in the ocean? What happens the day one lands somewhere far more densely populated? We are sending more objects into orbit right now than at any other point in human history, and a growing share of what goes up is eventually coming back down, in pieces, with no clear public record of exactly when, where, or from whom. Some scientists have been warning about a much darker version of this problem for decades. It even has a name: Kessler syndrome, first proposed back in 1978, describes a scenario where the amount of debris in orbit becomes so dense that collisions between objects start triggering more collisions, creating a chain reaction of fragments that makes entire regions of space around Earth dangerously unusable. It's not a fringe theory. It's a scenario taken seriously by space agencies around the world, precisely because we're already seeing early warning signs of it. Satellite operators are already reporting a growing number of near-miss events, situations where an active satellite has to burn fuel and shift its orbit specifically to avoid colliding with a piece of tracked debris. Every one of those maneuvers costs money, costs fuel, and shortens the operational life of the satellite performing it. It's an invisible tax being paid, quietly, by an industry that's growing faster than the infrastructure meant to keep it safe. We're not at a full Kessler syndrome scenario yet, but every uncontrolled re-entry, every unidentified object washing up on a beach somewhere in the world, is a small, visible symptom of a much larger problem building quietly above our heads, one nobody has fully solved, and one that's only getting more complicated as more countries and more private companies join the race to put things into orbit. The people of Forest Beach got lucky. Nobody was hurt. The spheres landed on an empty stretch of sand, not on a house, a road, or a school. The story ends, for now, with hazmat crews carefully placing metal spheres into secure barrels, a 50-meter exclusion zone slowly being lifted, and a quiet Queensland town going back to being exactly what it was before all of this happened. But luck is not a long-term strategy, and as the number of rockets launched every year keeps climbing, the odds of a beach town getting lucky twice in a row keep shrinking. There's a pattern worth noticing in every one of these stories, from Namibia to Kenya to Western Australia to Queensland. In almost every case, the object was found by an ordinary person, going about an ordinary day, with absolutely no expectation of stumbling onto a piece of space hardware. A farmer walking a field, a hiker on a trail, a local strolling a beach at low tide. None of them were space enthusiasts. None of them were looking for anything unusual. They just happened to be in the wrong place at exactly the right time to become the first human being to lay eyes on something that had spent months or years silently circling the planet before falling back down to Earth. That randomness is exactly what should give you pause. There's no pattern to who finds this stuff, no warning system that tells specific communities to be on alert. It's pure chance, over and over again, that decides whether a piece of falling space hardware lands somewhere empty or somewhere it really shouldn't. So here's where this leaves us. 6 mysterious silver spheres washed up on an Australian beach sparked a genuine public evacuation, briefly convinced parts of the internet that aliens had landed, and turned out to be something almost as strange in its own way. Fragments of a rocket that fell from orbit, from a country nobody has publicly named yet, as part of a pattern that's happening more often than most people realize, in more countries than most people would guess. The Australian Space Agency says the investigation is ongoing, which means, as of right now, this story is not actually finished. We don't yet know which rocket this was. We don't yet know which country will be asked to answer for it. And there is nothing stopping another set of mystery objects from washing up on another coastline next month, next week, or even while you're watching this video right now. Somewhere above you, at this exact moment, there are more than 14,000 active satellites circling the planet, along with millions of pieces of debris nobody is actively tracking. Most of it will stay up there for years, decades, sometimes centuries. But some of it is already falling, right now, quietly, towards somewhere on Earth that has no idea it's coming. And here's the part that puts everything in this story into perspective. This is only going to happen more, not less. Space agencies around the world have publicly discussed ambitious plans for the next decade, involving thousands of additional satellite launches, expanded constellations, and a genuinely global race to build out orbital infrastructure faster than any previous era in spaceflight history. Every one of those launches eventually produces spent stages, discarded components, and hardware that has to come back down eventually, whether anyone plans for it properly or not. Right now, the systems built to track, predict, and manage all of that debris are stretched thinner every single year, trying to keep pace with an industry expanding faster than the safety infrastructure around it. Forest Beach wasn't an isolated incident. It was a preview. If this story is the kind of thing you come here for, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because we're tracking exactly what agency names next, the moment it's confirmed. Drop a comment telling me what you think actually happened before the aliens theory got debunked. And if you know someone who's never once thought about what's quietly falling out of orbit above their own head, send them this video, because the next mystery sphere might not land on an empty beach. Thanks for watching.